Some inheritances come with more than memories. They come with ghosts that refuse to stay buried. Sarah Chen Morrison had driven 12 hours through winding Montana mountain roads to reach her grandmother's cabin, her swollen belly pressing against the steering wheel as snow began to dust the windshield of her aging Subaru. At 34 and 8 months pregnant, she wasn't supposed to be making this journey alone, but after discovering her husband's secret gambling debts that had drained their savings, solitude felt safer than betrayal. Her grandmother Mei Lin had left her this remote retreat in Glacier National Park, a woman who'd raised Sarah after her parents died, who'd taught her to track deer and read weather patterns, who'd supposedly lived a simple life as a seamstress in Chinatown. But when Sarah pried open the warped floorboards in the back bedroom to investigate a strange draft, she found something that made her blood run cold, stacks upon stacks of vintage $100 bills, perfectly preserved and bound with rubber bands, filling a hidden vault the size of a walk-in closet. $240 million. Money that, according to the faded newspaper clipping tucked beneath the first stack, had vanished during the Brinks security heist of 1978, America's greatest unsolved robbery. What kind of woman had her grandmother really been, and why were there fresh tire tracks in the snow outside her cabin? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the yellowed newspaper clipping, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid cabin air. The headline screamed across the decades, "Brinks armored car robbery nets thieves $240 million, largest heist in U.S. history." Below it, a grainy photograph showed FBI agents standing beside empty steel containers, their faces grim with the weight of failure. The money felt real enough under her fingertips, crisp bills that rustled with the whisper of secrets. Serial numbers ran in perfect sequence across each stack, as if someone had methodically organized a fortune with the precision of a bank vault. Sarah's investigative instincts, honed through 5 years with the Financial Crimes Division before she'd traded her badge for hiking boots, kicked into overdrive. This wasn't random cash hidden by a paranoid old woman. This was evidence. She struggled to her feet, one hand braced against her lower back as the baby shifted restlessly. The cabin around her suddenly felt different, less like a refuge and more like a crime scene she'd stumbled into without gloves or backup. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. Every creak of settling timber sounded like footsteps. The fresh tire tracks outside haunted her thoughts. Someone else knew about this place. Sarah forced herself to examine the hidden room more carefully, her phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The space had been carved directly into the mountain bedrock, lined with moisture barriers and climate controls that hummed almost inaudibly. This wasn't some hastily dug hiding spot. It was engineered for long-term storage, professional, expensive. Along one wall, she discovered a series of leather-bound ledgers, their spines marked with years spanning from 1978 to 2019, the year grandmother Mei Lin had died. Sarah pulled the first volume from its shelf, her heart hammering as she recognized the meticulous handwriting that had once penned birthday cards and grocery lists. The entries were coded, but patterns emerged as she flipped through pages of dates, numbers, and initials. Amounts moved in careful increments, 50,000 here, 100,000 there, always spread across different banks, different cities, money laundering. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her grandmother hadn't stumbled across stolen money. She'd been washing it for decades. A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin windows, and Sarah looked up to see snow falling harder now, thick flakes that would soon make the winding access road impassable. She was trapped here with evidence that could rewrite criminal history books and destroy the memory of the only family she'd ever truly known. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah pressed both hands to her belly, trying to center herself the way her wilderness guide training had taught her. Assess the situation, identify immediate threats, plan next steps. But every rational thought crashed against the impossible truth that gentle grandmother Mei Lin, who'd made dumplings every Sunday and insisted Sarah learn Mandarin even when she protested, had been running money for organized crime. Sarah grabbed the first ledger and the newspaper clipping, stuffing them into her jacket before making her way back through the false wall panel. The main cabin felt almost warm by comparison, its familiar sense of cedar and old wool now tinged with deception. She'd spent summers here as a teenager, helping Mei Lin tend the small garden and learning to identify edible plants. Had her grandmother been planning heists between teaching lessons about bear safety? Through the front window, the tire tracks were already disappearing under fresh snowfall, but they'd been there. Recent enough that the tread patterns were still visible when she'd arrived 3 hours ago, which meant someone had been here within the last day or two. Someone who knew about the money. Sarah's phone showed no signal. The mountains had always been a dead zone, part of what made this place perfect for hiding, but now isolation felt like vulnerability. She was 8 months pregnant, alone in a snowstorm, sitting on evidence of the crime of the century, with unknown parties potentially watching her every move. She opened the ledger again, scanning entries from the early 1980s. The amounts were staggering, but what chilled her most were the occasional margin notes in English: Chicago delivery complete and West Coast connections secure. This hadn't been a one-time operation. Mei Lin had built an empire. Another contraction gripped Sarah's abdomen. Not painful yet, but insistent enough to remind her that stress could trigger premature labor. She needed to make decisions quickly. Contact the FBI and destroy her family's legacy, or find a way to disappear before whoever made those tire tracks decided to come back. Outside, the storm was intensifying, and Sarah realized with growing dread that she might not have a choice in timing. The mountain would keep her here whether she wanted to stay or not, trapped with $240 million in blood money and the ghost of a grandmother she'd apparently never really known. The baby kicked again, and Sarah whispered to her belly, "What do we do now, little one?" As if in answer, headlights suddenly swept across the cabin windows through the swirling snow. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the headlights carved through the storm, growing brighter as they approached. She clicked off her phone's flashlight and pressed herself against the window frame, peering through the gap in the curtains. A dark SUV was climbing the final stretch of access road, its engine grinding against the steep grade and deepening snow. This wasn't some lost tourist. The driver knew exactly where they were going. The vehicle stopped 30 yards from the cabin, engine idling, headlights illuminating the swirling snowfall like a stage spotlight. Sarah could make out a single silhouette behind the wheel, but the glare made it impossible to identify details. Her mind raced through possibilities: FBI agents following up on old leads, descendants of the original thieves, or worse, people who'd been waiting 43 years for someone to finally access Mei Lin's hiding place. Another contraction rolled through her abdomen, this one stronger than before. Sarah pressed both hands to her belly, breathing through the discomfort while keeping her eyes fixed on the SUV. The baby chose this moment to practice gymnastics, tiny feet jabbing against her ribs as if responding to her elevated heart rate. "Not now," she whispered. "Please, not now." The headlights suddenly cut off, plunging the clearing back into storm-muffled darkness. Sarah heard a car door slam, followed by the crunch of boots on snow, heavy steps, deliberate. Someone who wasn't concerned about announcing their presence. Sarah's investigative training kicked in, overriding the panic. She grabbed the ledger from the table and shoved it under the couch cushions, then quickly surveyed the cabin for signs of her discovery. The false wall was closed, the hidden room sealed behind what looked like ordinary pine paneling. To a casual observer, nothing appeared disturbed. But her overnight bag sat open on the kitchen table, her toiletries scattered beside the kerosene lamp. Her jacket hung on the back of a chair, still damp from her earlier exploration. Anyone with half a brain would realize the cabin was occupied. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the thin mountain air. Sarah positioned herself behind the kitchen island, using it as a barrier between herself and the door. Her service weapon was locked in a gun safe back in Seattle. Fat lot of good it did her here. The only potential weapons within reach were a cast-iron skillet and a knife block that had seen better decades. "Miss Chen Morrison," a woman's voice called through the door. "My name is Angela Martinez. I'm with the National Park Service. I saw your vehicle and wanted to check that you're safe in this storm." Sarah's shoulders relaxed slightly. Park rangers made surprise wellness checks during severe weather. It was standard protocol for occupied cabins in remote areas, but something nagged at her. How had this Martinez person known her name? The cabin was registered under Mei Lin's estate, not Sarah's married name. "I'm fine," Sarah called back, not moving toward the door. "Thank you for checking." "Ma'am, I need to verify your condition visually. We've got whiteout conditions developing, and emergency services can't respond if something goes wrong. It'll just take a minute." The voice sounded professional, concerned, exactly how a park ranger should sound. But Sarah's instincts screamed warnings. In her 5 years investigating financial crimes, she'd learned to trust the feeling that something wasn't quite right, even when she couldn't articulate why. "Can you show me your identification through the window?" Sarah asked. A pause. "Then, of course, moving to your left side window now." Sarah heard boots crunching through snow around the cabin's perimeter. She crept toward the side window, staying low, and peered out. A figure in a dark parka stood in the lamplight spilling from the kitchen, holding up what looked like an official badge and identification card. But the distance and storm made details impossible to read. "I'm sorry, but I can't see it clearly enough," Sarah said, raising her voice to carry through the wall. "Can you leave your card by the door? I'll examine it after you've gone." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, are you experiencing medical distress? Your voice sounds strained." Sarah almost laughed despite her fear. 8 months pregnant and stressed out of her mind, of course her voice sounded strained, but the question felt like fishing, probing for information about her condition. "I'm pregnant," she said finally. "I came up here for some solitude before the baby arrives." "Congratulations," Martinez said, and there was something in her tone that made Sarah's skin crawl, not warmth or professional courtesy, but calculation. "When are you due?" The question crossed a line. No park ranger needed medical specifics for a wellness check. Sarah backed away from the window, her hands instinctively protective over her belly. "I think you should leave now," she called out. "I'm fine, and I don't require assistance." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the howling wind and Sarah's thundering pulse. Then she heard the boots moving again, circling back toward the front of the cabin. "Have a safe night, Miss Chen Morrison," Martinez said. "Try to stay warm." The words carried an undertone that felt more like a threat than a farewell. Sarah remained frozen behind the kitchen island for a full 10 minutes after the SUV's engine faded into the storm's white noise. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale forming small clouds in the cabin's chill. The woman, Martinez, had known her name, had circled the cabin like a predator surveying territory, had asked questions no park ranger would ask. The baby shifted restlessly, as if absorbing Sarah's tension through her bloodstream. Another contraction rippled across her abdomen, this one lasting nearly 30 seconds. She forced herself to breathe through it, counting the way her birthing class instructor had taught her. Too early. Still too early. When the pain subsided, Sarah crept to the front window and peered through the curtains. Fresh tire tracks carved deep ruts in the snow where the SUV had turned around. But the vehicle was gone. The storm had intensified, snow falling so heavily now that visibility dropped to mere yards. Even if she wanted to leave, the access road would be impassable within hours. She was trapped here, with $240 million in stolen money and people who knew exactly where to find her. Sarah retrieved the ledger from under the couch cushions, her hands trembling as she opened it again. The entries blurred together, dates, amounts, coded initials that suddenly felt less like abstract numbers and more like breadcrumbs leading dangerous people directly to her door. Her grandmother's meticulous handwriting, once a source of comfort, now read like evidence in a murder trial. A new page caught her attention, one she'd missed in her earlier panic. A loose sheet of paper tucked between the ledger's back pages, covered in Mei Lin's familiar script, but written in English rather than the coded shorthand. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found my secret. I'm sorry, little sparrow. I never wanted this burden to fall on your shoulders, but circumstances have a way of choosing for us. The money belongs to dangerous people who will never stop looking for it. I've kept them at bay for 40 years through careful distribution and strategic alliances, but my death will upset the balance. They'll come? There's a satellite phone in the kitchen pantry behind the rice containers. Battery should still hold charge. I've maintained it monthly. Speed dial 3 connects you to someone who can help, but trust no one else. Not the FBI, not local police, not anyone claiming to be law enforcement. You have a choice to make. Take what you need and disappear, or stay and fight for justice. But know that either path will change your life forever. The baby changes everything. Protect her above all else. Grandmother." Sarah's vision blurred as she read the last line. Her, Grandmother Mei Lin, had somehow known Sarah was carrying a daughter, though Sarah herself had only learned the baby's gender 2 weeks ago. The impossibility of it sent chills down her spine. She stumbled toward the kitchen pantry, shoving aside dusty cans and rice containers until her fingers found the device, a military-grade satellite phone, heavier than she'd expected. The battery indicator showed 3 bars. Functional. Speed dial 3. Someone who could help. But help with what? Escaping? Or walking deeper into whatever web her grandmother had spent 4 decades weaving? Another contraction hit, stronger this time, stealing her breath. Sarah gripped the pantry door frame until the pain passed, then checked her watch. 20 minutes since the last one. Still too far apart for active labor, but the stress was accelerating everything. Her body was preparing for birth, whether she was ready or not. The storm rattled the cabin's windows like an impatient visitor demanding entry. Through the howling wind, Sarah thought she heard something else, the distant rumble of another engine growing closer. Or maybe it was just the mountain itself groaning under the weight of accumulated snow. She had to make a decision. Now. The satellite phone felt warm in her palm, its red power button like a doorway to an unknown future. Speed dial 3 could be her grandmother's handler, another criminal, or genuinely someone who could help her escape this nightmare. But calling meant trusting Mei Lin's judgment, accepting that the woman who'd raised her had made choices that put them both in mortal danger. The alternative was trying to handle this alone, 8 months pregnant, trapped in a blizzard, with mysterious SUVs circling and dangerous people who'd waited 40 years to reclaim their fortune. Through the front window, headlights appeared again in the distance, growing stronger as they climbed the access road. Multiple vehicles this time, their beams cutting through the storm like searchlights hunting prey. Sarah's thumb hovered over the phone's power button as another contraction gripped her, harder and longer than before. The baby kicked frantically, tiny fists hammering against her ribs as if demanding to be born into whatever chaos awaited them. The headlights were getting closer. She pressed the button and waited for the phone to connect to whatever satellite still functioned above the storm, knowing that this single choice would determine whether her daughter was born into freedom or inherited a legacy written in blood. The satellite phone's screen flickered to life, displaying a weak signal bar that wavered like her resolve. Sarah stared at the device, her thumb paralyzed above the number pad. Speed dial 3, 2 simple button presses that would either save her life or seal her fate. What if Mei Lin's contact was another criminal? What if pressing those numbers alerted the very people she needed to hide from? Her grandmother's note had warned against trusting law enforcement, but trusting criminals seemed infinitely worse. Sarah's background in financial crimes investigation had taught her that organized crime operations never truly ended. They evolved, adapted, waited for opportunities exactly like this one. The headlights grew brighter through the storm, close enough now that she could count them. 3 vehicles climbing steadily up the access road, their engines laboring against the steep grade and accumulating snow. They moved with purpose, not the hesitant pace of lost travelers, but the determined advance of people who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah's breath came in sharp bursts that had nothing to do with contractions. Her analytical mind catalogued the tactical disadvantages: 8 months pregnant, alone, trapped by weather, no weapons, no backup, no escape route. Even if the satellite phone connected her to help, rescue would take hours in these conditions. She had minutes. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, a sharp reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just about her anymore. Every decision rippled forward into her daughter's future. If she called Maylin's contact and it went wrong, she'd be handing her unborn child a life of running and hiding. If she didn't call and the approaching vehicles contained hostile forces, there might not be any future to worry about. Another contraction seized her abdomen, this one lasting nearly 40 seconds. Sarah gripped the kitchen counter, breathing through the pain while watching the headlights crawl closer. 18 minutes since the last contraction. The stress was definitely accelerating her labor, her body preparing for birth at the worst possible moment. She tried to think like the investigator she'd been trained to be. What were the facts? Her grandmother had laundered money for organized crime for 4 decades. The original heist money was hidden here. Unknown parties were actively searching for it. Someone posing as a park ranger had already attempted contact, probing for information about Sarah's condition and location. The logical conclusion was terrifying. Whoever was coming up that mountain knew about the money and viewed Sarah as either an obstacle or an asset to be controlled. But calling the number meant accepting Maylin's criminal legacy as her own. It meant stepping fully into a world where her daughter would inherit enemies along with whatever twisted protection grandmother's contacts might offer. Sarah had spent her career putting financial criminals in prison. How could she now seek help from the very people she'd dedicated her life to stopping? The headlights were close enough now that she could hear engines straining against the grade. 3 vehicles suggested coordination, planning, not casual visitors or opportunistic treasure hunters, but organized operators with resources and patience. The kind of people who'd wait 43 years for their money and wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone standing in their way. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the satellite phone. Her wilderness guide training emphasized the importance of decisive action in crisis situations. Hesitation killed more people in the mountains than bad weather or equipment failure. But this decision carried consequences that extended far beyond personal survival. If she called and Maylin's contact was legitimate help, she might escape with her daughter's life and even some portion of the money to start over. If the contact was hostile, she'd be revealing her exact location to additional enemies. If she didn't call and tried to handle this alone, she was gambling on her ability to evade professional criminals while 8 months pregnant in a blizzard. The approaching engines grew louder, their rumble now audible over the storm's howling. Sarah estimated 5 minutes before they reached the cabin clearing. 5 minutes to decide whether to trust a dead woman's judgment about allies in a world of blood money and decades-old vengeances. Another brutal contraction seized her, dropping her to one knee beside the kitchen island. The pain was intensifying faster than it should, stress hormones flooding her system and triggering responses her body wasn't ready for. Her daughter was trying to be born into chaos, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that she was out of time for philosophical debates about right and wrong. The headlights swept across the cabin windows as the first vehicle rounded the final bend in the access road. Through the swirling snow, Sarah could see it was another dark SUV, followed closely by 2 more, professional, coordinated, dangerous. Her thumb hovered over the phone's keypad as another contraction built, her daughter's frantic movements echoing her own desperate need to escape whatever was approaching through the storm. Every instinct screamed that she was about to make a choice that would define the rest of their lives, assuming they survived the next few hours. The satellite phone's signal strengthened slightly, as if the mountains themselves were offering one last chance to reach for help, or walk willingly into a trap 40 years in the making. Sarah's finger stabbed the power button. The satellite phone hummed to life, its green glow casting eerie shadows across the kitchen as the first SUV's engine died outside. No more time for doubt. No more luxury of moral certainty. She pressed speed dial 3. The phone rang once, twice, then connected with a clarity that seemed impossible given the storm raging outside. A gravelly male voice answered on the third ring. Phoenix. Not hello. Not identification. Just a single word that carried weight Sarah couldn't fathom. "This is Sarah Chen Morrison," she whispered, crouching behind the kitchen island as heavy boots approached the cabin. "Maylin's granddaughter. She said to call this number if—" "How many vehicles?" The voice cut through her explanation with military precision. Sarah blinked. 3 SUVs, just arrived. Armed? I don't know. I can't see. Listen carefully. Is the back bedroom window accessible? Sarah's mind raced, remembering her earlier exploration of the cabin. Yes, but it's a 12-foot drop to the cliff path. Better than the alternative. Grab whatever you need and move. Now. Car doors slammed outside, multiple voices conferring in hushed tones. Sarah caught fragments through the storm. Lights are on, definitely occupied, no other exit routes. Her entire body rebelled against the idea of climbing out a window 8 months pregnant, but the authority in Phoenix's voice brooked no argument. This was someone accustomed to life-or-death decisions, someone Maylin had trusted with her deepest secrets. "What about the money?" Sarah hissed into the phone, already moving toward the bedroom. "Leave it. Your grandmother's real treasure isn't in that room." The cryptic response made no sense, but Sarah was beyond questioning. Another contraction gripped her as she grabbed her overnight bag, forcing her to pause and breathe through the pain. 15 minutes since the last one. Her daughter was determined to arrive tonight, whether or not the world was ready. "Alive. You're valuable," Phoenix continued, his voice steady in her ear. "Dead, you're just another loose end. They need you to access certain accounts. That buys time." The front door rattled under heavy knocks. "Miss Chen Morrison? This is Detective Martinez, Montana State Police. We need to speak with you about your grandmother's property." Martinez again, but now claiming to be state police instead of Park Service. The lie confirmed Sarah's worst suspicions about the earlier visit. "I'm not coming out," Sarah called toward the front room, while tiptoeing toward the back bedroom. "Show me proper identification and a warrant." Muffled conversation outside, then Martinez's voice again. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe this property contains evidence related to an ongoing federal investigation. We're authorized to enter if you don't cooperate." Sarah reached the bedroom and eased the window open, immediately hit by a blast of frigid air and stinging snow. The drop to the cliff path looked impossibly far, the rocks below slick with ice. But the voices outside were growing more impatient, and she caught the distinctive sound of someone testing the door handle. "Phoenix, I'm at the window. This is insane. Your grandmother survived 40 years by making impossible choices. Trust her blood." Something in those words steadied Sarah's nerves. Maylin had been barely older than Sarah when she'd made her first impossible choice, whatever that had been. She'd protected this secret, this money, this connection for 4 decades while raising a granddaughter and living an apparently normal life. If grandmother could navigate that maze, maybe Sarah could survive one night. The front door splintered inward with a crash that echoed through the cabin. Sarah dropped the phone into her jacket pocket and swung her leg over the windowsill. The wind tried to tear her from the frame, snow immediately soaking through her clothes. Below, the path was barely visible in the storm, but it led away from the cabin toward the deeper wilderness. "Search every room," Martinez's voice carried clearly from the front of the cabin. "She's here somewhere." Sarah lowered herself as far as possible before letting go, her pregnant belly making the maneuver awkward and terrifying. She landed hard on the icy path, jarring her entire body and triggering another contraction. Pain shot through her knees and up her spine, but nothing felt broken. Footsteps thundered through the cabin above as she pressed herself against the cliff face. Beam lights swept the front clearing, but the back path remained hidden in shadow and storm, for the moment. The satellite phone buzzed in her pocket. Phoenix's voice was barely audible over the wind. Move east along the path. Quarter-mile to the old mining road. I'm coming for you. Sarah looked east into howling darkness, seeing nothing but snow and rock and the terrifying possibility of falling to her death. Behind her, harsh voices echoed from the cabin as the intruders discovered the hidden room and its fortune. She'd crossed the threshold now, left safety, money, and moral certainty behind. Whatever came next, she was committed to surviving it, for her daughter, for justice, and for answers about the woman who'd raised her. Sarah Chen Morrison stepped into the storm and disappeared. The cliff path was a nightmare of loose rock and black ice that threatened to send Sarah tumbling into the abyss with every step. She pressed herself against the stone face, fingers numb and bleeding as she felt for handholds in the darkness. The wind howled like a living thing, trying to tear her from the mountain's embrace. Behind her, flashlight beams swept frantically from the cabin windows. Voices carried on the storm, Martinez barking orders, others responding with military efficiency. They'd found the open window. It wouldn't take long before they realized where she'd gone. Another contraction seized her halfway along the path, forcing her to her knees on the icy stone. Sarah bit down on her jacket sleeve to muffle her cry, tasting blood and snow. 12 minutes since the last one. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, and delivering a child on an exposed cliff face in a blizzard wasn't survivable for either of them. "Move, Sarah," she whispered through gritted teeth. "Just move." The path curved around a rocky outcrop, and suddenly she could see the old mining road Phoenix had mentioned, a barely visible scar cutting across the mountainside about 200 yards below. Getting there meant leaving the relative safety of the cliff face and traversing an exposed slope, where one wrong step would send her tumbling into darkness. Her satellite phone buzzed. Phoenix's voice was clearer now, suggesting he was closer than before. "Status?" "On the path. I can see the mining road." Sarah paused, listening to the sound of engines starting behind her. "They're mobilizing." "Good. Keep them focused on you for another 3 minutes." The comment sent ice through her veins, colder than the mountain wind. "What do you mean, keep them focused on me?" "Your grandmother didn't just hide money, Sarah. She hid evidence. Financial records, transaction logs, names and dates going back 40 years. The real treasure is documentation that could bring down an entire network, people who have become very powerful, very legitimate in the decades since the original heist." Sarah began her descent toward the mining road, half sliding down the treacherous slope. "So, they're not just here for the money?" "The money's meaningless compared to those records. Your grandmother scattered copies in safe deposit boxes across 3 states, but she kept the master files here. Without them, the network stays buried. With them," Phoenix paused, "let's just say some very prominent people would face serious consequences." A new sound carried on the wind, the distinctive whir of helicopter rotors. Sarah looked up to see navigation lights cutting through the storm, moving fast and low. Not rescue, reinforcement. "Phoenix, they've got air support." "I see it. Change of plans. There's a cave entrance about 50 yards ahead of you on the right side of the road. Natural formation, hidden behind a rockfall. Get there and wait." Sarah pushed harder, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. The baby's movements had become erratic, tiny limbs thrashing as stress hormones flooded her system. Behind her, she could hear shouting as Martinez's team discovered her tracks. Flashlight beams swept the mountainside like searchlights hunting prey. The helicopter swept overhead, its downwash sending snow spiraling in blinding clouds. A spotlight pierced the darkness, following the path Sarah had taken. In seconds, they'd have her exact location. She dove behind a boulder cluster just as the light swept past, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cave entrance Phoenix had mentioned was nowhere visible, just solid rock face and scattered debris from ancient landslides. "Phoenix, I don't see any cave. Look for 3 stacked boulders forming a triangle. The entrance is behind them." Sarah squinted through the swirling snow, finally spotting the formation he'd described. What she'd taken for natural rockfall was actually a carefully constructed blind, stones positioned to hide a gap in the cliff face that was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She wedged herself into the opening as the helicopter made another pass, its spotlight turning the world white. The cave beyond was larger than expected, carved from living rock with tool marks that suggested human excavation, a mining operation probably abandoned for decades. "I'm in," she whispered into the phone. "Good. Now listen carefully. Your grandmother's real legacy isn't money, it's justice. Those financial records document every transaction, every payment, every crime committed by people who thought they were untouchable. But they're encrypted, and the key is something only family would know." Another contraction hit, stronger than any before. Sarah doubled over in the cave's darkness, breathing hard until the pain passed. 8 minutes. Her daughter was determined to be born tonight, in the middle of a 40-year-old criminal conspiracy. What kind of key? Something personal, a date, a name, a phrase that meant something to Mei Lin. She said you'd know it when the time came. The helicopter settled somewhere above, its engines winding down. Through the cave entrance, Sarah could see flashlights descending the mountainside. Martinez's team was closing in, but they'd have to search every shadow and crevice to find her hiding spot. If Phoenix was right, she wasn't just carrying her grandmother's money, she was carrying the ammunition to bring down an entire criminal network. The question was whether she'd live long enough to use it. Sarah's breathing echoed in the cave's darkness as another contraction built, this one lasting nearly a full minute. 5 minutes between contractions now. Her daughter was coming whether the world was ready or not, and the thought of giving birth in this cold stone tomb filled her with desperate panic. Through the cave entrance, she could hear Martinez's team spreading out across the mountainside, their tactical communication crackling through radio static, professional hunters with resources and patience closing the net methodically. The helicopter's rotors had gone silent, but Sarah knew it was perched somewhere above like a mechanical predator waiting to pounce. "Phoenix," she whispered into the phone, pressing deeper into the cave's shadows. "How long until you reach me?" "I'm already here." The voice came from behind her, inside the cave, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. She spun around, her hands instinctively protecting her belly, but saw only darkness stretching deeper into the mountain's heart. "Don't move," the voice continued, closer now. "And don't be afraid. I've been protecting your family longer than you've been alive." A small LED light clicked on, revealing a figure that defied every expectation Sarah had formed. Phoenix was a woman, perhaps 60 years old, with silver-streaked black hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades in harsh environments. Asian features, similar enough to Mei Lin that Sarah wondered if they were related. She wore tactical gear that looked military-grade and moved with the fluid confidence of someone equally comfortable with violence or diplomacy. "You look like her," Phoenix said softly. "Mei Lin at your age, stubborn, brilliant, and in way over her head. Who are you, really?" Sarah's voice came out as a croak. "Someone who made the same impossible choice your grandmother faced. Someone who chose justice over law, family over country." Phoenix settled onto a rock ledge with practiced ease. "My name is Dr. Helen Zhao. I was a financial analyst for the Treasury Department until I discovered that some of the biggest banks in America were laundering money for organized crime, and my own government was looking the other way." The story spilled out in whispered fragments while Martinez's team searched the rocks above. Helen had been investigating financial crimes in the 1970s when she uncovered a network of corruption that reached from street-level loan sharks to federal banking regulators. When she tried to report her findings, she'd been threatened, discredited, and finally marked for elimination. "Mei Lin saved my life," Helen continued. "Pulled me out of a hotel room in Denver 30 seconds before a car bomb went off. She was already running her own operation by then, skimming money from criminal transactions and documenting everything, building a case that could bring down the entire network." Another contraction seized Sarah. this one so intense that she couldn't suppress a low moan. Helen was beside her instantly, checking her pulse and breathing with the efficiency of someone with medical training. "We need to get you out of here soon," Helen said. "But first, you need to understand what you're really carrying." From a tactical pack, Helen produced a ruggedized tablet computer. The screen showed complex financial charts and transaction records, millions of dollars flowing through hundreds of accounts over 4 decades. Names Sarah recognized. Senators, federal judges, banking executives who'd appeared on magazine covers and testified before Congress. "Your grandmother wasn't just laundering money," Helen explained. "She was building the most comprehensive financial crime database in history. Every payment, every bribe, every illegal transaction documented with surgical precision. She called it her insurance policy." Sarah stared at the screen, trying to process the scope of what she was seeing. This goes all the way to Washington and beyond. International banking, offshore accounts, shell corporations spanning 6 countries. The people hunting you tonight aren't just criminals. They're pillars of American society who've spent 40 years believing their secrets were safe. The tablet showed a final screen that made Sarah's blood freeze, a list of names marked for elimination, dating back to 1979. Helen's name was there, crossed out with a note, handled March 15, 1979. My Lynn's name appeared twice, crossed out last month with Sarah's name added below it. "They know about the baby," Helen said quietly. "4th generation Chen. They can't risk letting your family line continue, not with what you might inherit beyond money." Outside the cave, radio chatter indicated Martinez's team was moving closer. They had thermal imaging now, systematically scanning every hiding place. Sarah and Helen had perhaps minutes before discovery. "There's a way out through the back of this cave," Helen said, shouldering her pack. "An old mining shaft that connects to a network of tunnels. But it's dangerous, especially for someone in your condition." Sarah struggled to her feet as another contraction built. The choice was no choice at all, certain capture and death outside, or possible survival through the mountain's dark heart. "Lead the way," she whispered. Helen's light revealed a narrow passage disappearing into absolute darkness. As they moved deeper underground, Sarah realized she was literally following in her grandmother's footsteps, trusting a stranger with her daughter's life, because Maylene had trusted this woman with secrets worth killing for. Above them, Martinez's voice echoed. "Thermal shows 2 signatures moving underground. Call in the mining maps." The hunt was far from over. The mining tunnel stretched ahead like the throat of some ancient beast, its walls sweating condensation that had frozen into treacherous sheets of ice. Sarah's LED headlamp, borrowed from Helen's pack, carved a weak cone of light through darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Behind them, the sound of pursuit echoed through stone. Boots on rock, radio chatter, the methodical advance of hunters who knew their prey was trapped. "How much farther?" Sarah whispered, one hand pressed against the tunnel wall for balance, the other cradling her belly as another contraction built. 3 minutes since the last one. Her daughter was coming, whether they found safety or not. "The main junction is just ahead," Helen replied, her voice barely audible over the sound of their labored breathing. "From there, we have options." But Sarah could hear the uncertainty beneath Helen's confidence. These tunnels were decades old, potentially unstable, and their maps were 40 years out of date. They were navigating by memory and hope through a maze that could become their tomb with one wrong turn. The contraction peaked, forcing Sarah to stop and brace herself against the frozen stone. Pain radiated through her entire body, and when it finally subsided, she realized something had changed. A warm wetness between her legs, soaking through her clothes. "Helen!" Sarah's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "My water just broke." Helen's light snapped toward her, illuminating Sarah's pale, terrified face. Without hesitation, the older woman moved closer, checking Sarah's condition with the efficiency of someone who'd delivered babies in far worse circumstances. "How long have you been in active labor?" Since the cabin, maybe longer. Sarah tried to keep moving, but her legs felt like they were made of water. How long do I have? With a first baby? Could be hours, could be minutes. Helen shouldered Sarah's weight, helping her navigate the increasingly treacherous path. But we need shelter soon, real shelter, not these tunnels. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was getting closer. Flashlight beams reflected off ice and stone, creating a disorienting light show in the tunnel's depths. Martinez's team had found the cave entrance and was systematically exploring every passage. There, Helen pointed ahead to where the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. The junction. What they found defied every assumption Sarah had made about abandoned mining operations. The chamber was vast, carved from living rock with engineering precision that spoke of serious investment. But more importantly, it wasn't abandoned. Generator-powered lights strung along the walls revealed a sophisticated operation. Computer equipment, communication arrays, filing cabinets that looked like they'd been maintained for decades. "Welcome to your grandmother's real legacy," Helen said softly. The computers were state-of-the-art, their screens displaying financial data streams from banks and government agencies around the world. Real-time intelligence gathering on a scale that rivaled federal law enforcement. Sarah stared at monitors showing bank transfers, email communications, and surveillance footage from locations across 3 continents. She's been running this for 40 years? With help. Helen moved to one of the terminals, her fingers flying across the keyboard, a network of people who chose justice over institutional loyalty. Former FBI agents, Treasury investigators, bank employees who got tired of watching criminals buy their way out of consequences. Another contraction hit, stronger than any before, and Sarah collapsed into a chair that had clearly been positioned for someone who spent long hours monitoring these screens. When the pain passed, she found herself staring at a photograph taped to the monitor, herself at age 12, grinning gap-toothed at a camera, while Mei Lin looked on with obvious pride. "She never stopped watching over you," Helen said gently, "even when keeping her distance was the only way to keep you safe." The sound of boots on stone was getting closer. Martinez's team had reached the junction and was systematically exploring each tunnel. Sarah could hear radio chatter coordinating their search, professional hunters closing in on cornered prey. The data, Sarah gasped between contractions. If it's so important, why didn't she turn it over to the authorities years ago? Helen's laugh was bitter. Because half the authorities are in that database as criminals themselves. Judges who fixed sentences, prosecutors who buried cases, federal agents who looked the other way. Your grandmother spent 40 years building a case that was absolutely bulletproof because she knew she'd only get one chance to bring it all down. The monitor in front of Sarah suddenly changed, displaying a single prompt, encryption key required. "This is it," Helen said urgently, "the master database. Everything your grandmother collected, organized and verified. But it's locked," and she said only family would know the key. Sarah stared at the blinking cursor as another contraction built. In the distance, flashlight beams were getting brighter. Martinez's team had found the right tunnel and was approaching fast. Her daughter was minutes away from being born into a world where powerful people wanted her dead for the crime of carrying Chen blood. The key. Something personal. Something only family would know. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about the woman who'd raised her, the bedtime stories and gentle lessons and quiet moments that had shaped her entire worldview. And suddenly, she knew. Sarah's fingers trembled over the keyboard as another contraction built, but she forced herself to type the words that had echoed through her childhood like a lullaby. Mountains remember everything. Her grandmother's voice, gentle but firm, speaking those words every time they'd hiked together in the Cascades. Mountains remember everything, little sparrow. The storms, the sunshine, the secrets people think they can bury. We must remember too, so the truth doesn't get lost. The screen flashed green. Access granted. But instead of the database opening, alarms began shrieking throughout the chamber. Red lights strobed against the stone walls as monitors displayed a cascading system failure. Helen's face went white as she frantically typed commands that seemed to have no effect. "What's happening?" Sarah shouted over the noise. "Remote deletion protocol," Helen said, her voice hollow with despair. "Someone's triggered a kill switch, everything. 40 years of evidence, it's all being wiped." The monitors showed file systems collapsing in real time, terabytes of carefully gathered evidence disappearing into digital oblivion. Names, dates, financial records, recorded confessions, decades of meticulous documentation vanishing as if it had never existed. Sarah watched in horror as her grandmother's life's work self-destructed before her eyes. The database showing corrupt judges flickered and died. The financial transaction records linking senators to organized crime dissolved into empty directories. Video testimonies from protected witnesses became blank files with meaningless names. "Can you stop it?" Sarah's voice cracked as another contraction seized her, this one lasting nearly 90 seconds. Helen's hands flew across multiple keyboards, trying every protocol she knew, but the deletion was automated and unstoppable. The system's designed to protect itself. If the wrong person gains access, or if it detects a security breach. She slammed her fist against the desk in frustration. 40 years of evidence, gone. The sound of approaching boots grew louder. Martinez's voice echoed through the tunnels, heat signatures confirmed in the main chamber. "Move in." Sarah doubled over as the most intense contraction yet ripped through her body. When it passed, she realized she could feel her daughter's head pressing down, ready to enter a world where justice had just died with a computer crash. "Helen," Sarah gasped, "there has to be backup copies, redundancy systems. My grandmother was too careful." "The safe deposit boxes," Helen whispered, hope flickering in her eyes. "She said she scattered copies across 3 states, but I never knew the locations. She kept that information." Helen's face fell. "In the main database, which is gone." Flashlight beams suddenly blazed into the chamber as Martinez's team breached the final tunnel. Sarah found herself staring down the barrels of multiple assault rifles, held by professionals who'd clearly done this before. Martinez himself stepped forward, his expression mixing relief with cold satisfaction. "Dr. Sarah Chen Morrison," he said formally, "you've led us quite a chase." "The money's in the cabin," Sarah said through gritted teeth, as another contraction built. "Take it and leave us alone." Martinez's laugh was genuinely amused. "Money? Ms. Morrison, this was never about money. Though I admit watching 40 years of seditious data delete itself has been quite satisfying." He gestured at the dying monitors around them. "Your grandmother cost some very important people considerable anxiety over the years. Tonight, that anxiety ends." Helen stepped protectively in front of Sarah, her hands raised but her stance suggesting she was far from defenseless. "The girl's in labor. Whatever grievances you have with the Chen family, she needs medical attention." "Oh, she'll receive the finest medical care," Martinez said smoothly, "right after she helps us verify that every copy of her grandmother's insurance policy has been properly disposed of. We wouldn't want any loose ends threatening national security." Sarah's vision blurred as pain overwhelmed her. Her daughter was coming now, whether the world was ready or not. She could feel the unstoppable biological imperative taking control, her body preparing for birth even as armed men debated her execution. The last monitor flickered and went dark. 40 years of carefully gathered evidence against corruption at the highest levels of government had been reduced to empty hard drives and meaningless file fragments. Her grandmother's sacrifice, Helen's decades of dangerous work, the risks taken by countless whistleblowers and informants, all meaningless now. Sarah felt her daughter shift inside her, preparing for her first breath, and realized with crystalline clarity that she had nothing left to bargain with. No evidence, no leverage, no way to protect the tiny life about to enter this world. The network her grandmother had spent 4 decades documenting would survive, their crimes buried deeper than ever. Martinez raised his weapon, and Sarah understood that her daughter would be born an orphan in the next few minutes, if she was born at all. The mountains would remember everything, just as Maylene had always said. But sometimes remembering wasn't enough to stop history from repeating its cruelest patterns. All seemed lost. The first gunshot shattered the chamber's electric tension, but it wasn't Martinez who fired. Helen Zhao moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd survived 40 years of playing the most dangerous game imaginable, the small pistol appearing in her hand as if materialized from thin air. The lead operative dropped with a surprised grunt, his weapon clattering across stone as Helen rolled behind a bank of computer terminals. "Down!" she shouted to Sarah, who was already collapsing as another massive contraction seized her body. But Sarah's attention wasn't on the sudden firefight erupting around her. As she fell to her knees beside the main terminal, her hand struck the keyboard, and something impossible happened. The screen flickered back to life, displaying a single line of text that made her grandmother's true genius finally clear. Decoy deletion protocol complete. Activate primary archive? YN. Through the haze of labor pain and gunfire, Sarah understood with crystalline clarity what Maylene had done. The elaborate underground facility, the sophisticated computers, the 40 years of accumulated evidence, all of it was a shell game designed to protect something far more valuable. The real database had never been here. Sarah's fingers found the keyboard as bullets sparked off stone around her. She typed Y just as Martinez appeared above her, his weapon trained on her head, his face twisted with the fury of a man who'd just realized he'd been outmaneuvered by a dead woman. "Step away from the terminal," he snarled. But the screen was already changing, displaying an address Sarah recognized with shock, the storage unit facility in Kalispell where she'd stopped for supplies 3 days ago. Unit 247. Rented under the name Lee Sparrow 40 years ago and maintained with automatic payments that would continue until 2099. Her grandmother's pet name for her. Lee Sparrow. "You clever old woman," Helen breathed from behind her makeshift cover, having caught a glimpse of the screen. The entire facility was bait. Everything that mattered is off-site. Martinez's face went dead white as he read the display. "That unit's been under federal surveillance for 2 months. If you've triggered an automated release..." The screen updated with a new message that sent ice through Sarah's veins. "Dead man's switch activated." Contents released to Washington Post, New York Times, FBI Internal Affairs, Senate Intelligence Committee, International Criminal Court. Estimated delivery 72 hours. The revelation hit Sarah with more force than any contraction. Her grandmother hadn't just collected evidence, she'd created an automated insurance policy that would outlive them all. Every email, every bank transfer, every recorded conversation detailing 4 decades of high-level corruption was already racing toward journalists and investigators who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Martinez lowered his weapon, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and something approaching respect. She knew. Somehow she knew we'd find this place eventually. Sarah doubled over as the strongest contraction yet seized her, but even through the overwhelming pain she could see the beautiful symmetry of Maylene's final gambit. The old woman had spent her entire adult life being hunted, staying one step ahead of people who controlled courts and federal agencies and international banking systems. She'd let them think they were closing in, let them believe they could still contain the damage. But she'd been teaching them the most important lesson of her life. Mountains remember everything, and some secrets are too big to bury. "The child," Helen called out urgently. "She's crowning." Sarah felt her daughter's head emerge as another wave of revelation crashed over her. The money in the cabin's hidden room, sequential bills from a 1970s bank robbery, that had been bait too. A red herring designed to make her hunters believe they understood the stakes while the real treasure remained hidden in plain sight. Maylene hadn't been a criminal mastermind. She'd been something far more dangerous to people like Martinez, a meticulous archivist who'd spent 40 years documenting how democracy could be purchased by anyone with sufficient funds and flexible morals. Martinez was shouting into his radio, trying to coordinate damage control for a catastrophe that was already unstoppable. Federal teams would already be mobilizing to intercept the data releases, but Maylene had been planning this moment for decades. The evidence would be distributed through channels and backup systems that had been tested and refined over 40 years of survival. Sarah's daughter slipped into the world just as the final pieces of the puzzle locked into place. Helen's experienced hands caught the tiny, perfect child as Sarah finally understood the true inheritance Maylene had left her. Not money, not evidence, but the knowledge that justice sometimes required a lifetime of patience, and that the most powerful weapon against corruption wasn't violence or politics, it was the simple, relentless documentation of truth. Her daughter's first cry echoed through the stone chamber, strong and clear and absolutely fearless. Martinez stared at the baby with something approaching awe, as if recognizing that he was witnessing the birth of the fourth generation of women who would never stop fighting. The mountains had remembered everything, and now, finally, the world would too. The sound of her daughter's cry seemed to transform the entire chamber. Where moments before there had been the cold tension of predators and prey, now there was something primal and sacred that even armed mercenaries couldn't ignore. Helen wrapped the tiny, perfect child in Sarah's jacket, her experienced hands working with gentle efficiency despite the chaos surrounding them. "She's beautiful," Helen whispered, placing the baby against Sarah's chest. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs like her great-grandmother. Sarah stared down at her daughter's face, impossibly small, impossibly fierce, and felt something shift inside her that went deeper than exhaustion or relief. This child had entered the world at the exact moment when 40 years of careful planning had finally borne fruit. It felt like destiny, or perhaps simply the mountain's way of marking significant moments. Martinez was still barking orders into his radio, but his voice carried the hollow edge of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Negative, the package is already in motion. I repeat, containment has failed." He caught Sarah watching him, and his expression darkened. "This isn't over, Ms. Morrison. Evidence can be discredited. Witnesses can be... Can be what?" Helen's voice carried decades of quiet authority. Silenced? Like the 12 people who've died protecting this information over the years? Like Chen Maylin herself? The accusation hung in the chamber's cold air. Martinez's remaining operatives shifted uncomfortably. Professional killers, perhaps, but not completely comfortable with the implications of what they'd been hunting. Sarah felt her strength returning with each breath her daughter took. The physical ordeal of birth was over, but something new was beginning. A clarity of purpose that her grandmother had spent a lifetime preparing her for without either of them fully realizing it. "You killed her," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. The heart attack wasn't natural. Martinez's silence was answer enough. Helen moved closer, still vigilant but protective now rather than combative. Maylin knew it was coming. The last time we spoke, she said they were closing in faster than expected. She'd started the final protocols weeks ago. On the monitors around them, status updates continued scrolling past. Data packets reaching servers in 17 countries, backup systems activating in sequence, dead man switches that had been tested and refined for decades finally fulfilling their purpose. Sarah watched names and dollar amounts flash by, recognizing some from her years investigating financial crimes, seeing others that made her breath catch. "Senators," she whispered, "federal judges, cabinet members, 3 presidents," Helen added grimly, "though one of them's been dead for 15 years. The scope was staggering. Sarah had investigated white-collar crime for 6 years, had thought she understood the scale of institutional corruption, but this was something else entirely. A systematic documentation of how American democracy had been quietly auctioned off to the highest bidders over 4 decades. Her daughter stirred against her chest, tiny fingers grasping at air, and Sarah felt the weight of inheritance settling over both of them. Not the burden of secrets or the curse of running forever, but something far more powerful, the responsibility of witnesses. "What happens now?" she asked Helen. Now we wait. The evidence release is automated, but it will take time for journalists to verify the documents, for prosecutors to build cases, for the full scope to become clear. Helen's smile was tired but genuine. Your grandmother designed it that way. Chaos all at once can be contained or discredited. Truth revealed slowly, carefully, with proper documentation. That's much harder to bury. Martinez holstered his weapon, the gesture of a professional acknowledging checkmate. You think this changes anything? Evidence gets buried. Witnesses have accidents. The system protects itself. The system protected itself when it was dealing with isolated threats, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Individual whistleblowers, single investigations. But this isn't individual anymore. She gestured at the monitors displaying confirmation messages from around the globe. 40 years of evidence, distributed simultaneously to hundreds of recipients across 17 countries. Backup copies in systems your people don't even know exist. Dead man's switches that will keep releasing information for decades if anything happens to the people Mei-Lin protected. Her daughter's eyes opened for the first time, dark and alert, seeming to focus on Sarah's face with impossible awareness. In that moment, Sarah understood what her grandmother had really been building. Not just a case against corruption, but a self-sustaining system of accountability that would outlive all of them. She wasn't just gathering evidence, Sarah realized aloud. She was building a new kind of justice system, one that can't be bought or intimidated or buried in bureaucracy. Helen nodded approvingly. Now you're beginning to understand your real inheritance. Outside the chamber, Sarah could hear new voices, different accents, different radio protocols. Martinez heard them too, his face cycling through recognition and resignation. FBI Internal Affairs, Helen explained. The real ones, not the people who've been hunting you. Sarah held her daughter closer as footsteps approached, finally understanding that they weren't prey anymore. They were the beginning of something Mei-Lin had spent a lifetime preparing, a reckoning that would reshape everything. The FBI Internal Affairs team moved with a precision that was somehow different from Martinez's mercenaries, methodical rather than predatory, their weapons drawn but not aimed with killing intent. The lead agent was a compact woman in her 50s whose eyes took in the scene with the sharp assessment of someone who'd been expecting exactly what she found. Agent Catherine Walsh, FBI Internal Affairs, she announced, her voice carrying absolute authority. Martinez, step away from the civilians. Martinez's laugh was bitter. You're too late, Walsh. The damage is already done. 40 years of carefully managed operations just went public because of this woman's misguided idealism. Sarah felt her daughter's tiny hand close around her finger as she watched the confrontation unfold. The baby's grip was surprisingly strong, anchoring her to this moment when everything her grandmother had worked for was finally coming to light. The damage, Agent Walsh said coldly, was done by the people you've been protecting. We've been tracking your unit for 18 months, Martinez, waiting for you to lead us to the source. She glanced at the monitors still displaying global confirmation messages. Though I admit, we didn't expect quite this level of comprehensive documentation. Helen emerged fully from behind the computer terminals, her hands visible but her posture still alert. How long have you known about the corruption network? Fragments for years. Enough to know we had a cancer in the bureau, but never enough to cut it out cleanly. Walsh's gaze moved to Sarah and her newborn daughter with something approaching reverence. Your grandmother was careful. Too careful for us to trace, but careful enough that when evidence started appearing in our dead drops, we knew it was legitimate. The realization hit Sarah like another contraction. She was feeding you information all along, building a case from both sides. Mei-Lin understood something that most whistleblowers miss, Walsh explained. Dramatic revelations get buried or discredited. But if you can get law enforcement to build their own parallel case, using their own methods and protocols, she gestured at Martinez, who was now being systematically disarmed by her team. Then, when the full evidence emerges, there's already a framework in place to act on it. Sarah's daughter made a small sound, not quite crying, more like a question. and Sarah found herself answering in soft Mandarin, words her grandmother had taught her decades ago. The lullaby seemed to calm not just the baby, but something in the stone chamber itself, as if the mountains were finally exhaling after holding their breath for 40 years. "The storage unit in Kalispell," Sarah said. "How long before—" "Already secured," Walsh confirmed, along with 17 other locations across 3 states. "Your grandmother's network was more extensive than anyone imagined. Safe deposit boxes, storage units, safety deposit accounts in banks that don't even exist anymore." Her expression grew somber. "She spent 4 decades preparing for this moment, Ms. Morrison, building redundancy upon redundancy, ensuring that even if 90% of her evidence was destroyed, the remaining 10% would be enough to bring down the entire network." Martinez spoke up from where 2 agents were securing his hands behind his back. "You have no idea what you're destroying. The arrangements we maintained, they prevented wars, stabilized economies, protected American interests across 6 continents. By selling access to the highest bidder," Helen shot back. "By turning federal agencies into private security firms for whoever could afford the membership fee." Sarah watched Martinez's face as the scope of his defeat became clear. This wasn't just about the money in her grandmother's cabin, or even about the evidence that was now spreading across the globe. This was about a fundamental shift in power, from the shadows back into the light, from private arrangements to public accountability. Her daughter's breathing was steady and strong against her chest. Sarah found herself thinking about the world this child would inherit. Not the one Mei Lin had been forced to navigate, where truth was a luxury and justice was a commodity, but something cleaner. Not perfect, but honest about its imperfections. "What happens to us now?" Sarah asked, though for the first time in days, the question didn't carry the weight of desperation. Agent Walsh knelt beside them, her expression gentling as she looked at the newborn. "Now you disappear for a while. New identities, new lives, at least until the trials are over and the immediate danger passes." She paused. "Though I suspect your grandmother left instructions for that too." Helen smiled for the first time since Sarah had met her. "Box 247 in the 3rd National Bank of Helena. Opened the day you were born, Sarah." She said it contained everything Lee Sparrow would need to fly properly. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of her inheritance settling around her shoulders. Not just evidence or money or secrets, but the knowledge that some fights were worth a lifetime of sacrifice and that the most powerful legacy wasn't wealth. It was the courage to demand that power answer to truth. Her daughter stirred again, and Sarah realized they weren't finishing something her grandmother had started. They were beginning something entirely new. The sound of helicopters cutting through the mountain air shattered the relative calm of the chamber. Sarah felt her daughter tense against her chest as the mechanical thunder grew closer, and she recognized the shift in Agent Walsh's posture. From controlled authority to active alarm. "Those aren't ours," Walsh said, her weapon already drawn. "Martinez, who else knew about this location?" Martinez's smile was cold even with his hands secured behind his back. "You think I'm the apex predator in this ecosystem? I'm middle management, Agent Walsh. The real players don't wear badges or carry government credentials." Through the chamber's reinforced windows, Sarah could see running lights descending toward the mining complex. 3 aircraft, military specification, moving with the coordinated precision of a strike team. Her grandmother's automated systems were still displaying confirmation messages from around the globe, but Sarah suddenly understood that the evidence release was only the first move in a much larger game. "Helen," she said urgently, struggling to sit up while protecting her newborn daughter, "the final protocol." Mei Lin mentioned something about a final protocol. Helen's fingers flew across the computer interface, her face grave. "If external forces attempt to interfere with evidence distribution, all remaining data gets released immediately, instead of over the planned 18-month timeline." She looked up, eyes bright with understanding and terror. "Everything at once. Every name, every transaction, every recorded conversation from 40 years of documentation." Agent Walsh was coordinating with her team through hand signals while speaking rapidly into her radio. "Command, we need immediate extraction. Multiple unidentified aircraft, military configuration, likely hostile." Sarah felt a contraction of fear rather than labor. Her daughter was less than an hour old, still slick with birth and utterly vulnerable, and now armed mercenaries were landing outside the only exit from this underground facility. But as she looked at her child's perfect, peaceful face, something crystallized inside her that went beyond maternal instinct. This was the test Mei Lin had spent 40 years preparing her for, even if neither of them had fully understood it. Not just whether Sarah could survive the revelation of her grandmother's secrets, but whether she had the courage to see them through to their conclusion, regardless of personal cost. "How long before they breach the facility?" Sarah asked Walsh. "Minutes. Maybe less if they have the right equipment." Sarah made her decision with the same instinctive certainty that had guided her through labor. "Helen, activate the final protocol." "Sarah, no," Walsh protested. "If all that evidence hits simultaneously, the chaos could collapse. Could collapse a corrupt system that's been poisoning American democracy for 4 decades. Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength even as her body remained weak from birth. "My grandmother spent her entire adult life gathering this evidence. My daughter was born at the exact moment it started going public. This isn't coincidence, it's completion." Helen's hand hovered over the interface. "Once I trigger this, there's no taking it back. Every major government and financial institution on the planet will be simultaneously dealing with evidence of systematic corruption. The economic disruption alone." "The economic disruption of letting this continue is worse," Sarah said, thinking of her husband's gambling debts, of the predatory systems that had trapped him and thousands like him, of the institutional rot that made such exploitation not just possible but profitable. Some structures need to collapse before you can build something better. The sound of cutting tools echoed through the facility's upper levels. Martinez was watching the exchange with fascination, as if Sarah were a chess piece that had just transformed into something he'd never seen before. "You're not your grandmother," he said. Mei Lin was patient, careful, willing to work within systems even as she documented their failures. "You're something else entirely." Sarah looked down at her daughter, who was regarding the world with the fearless curiosity that only the very young possessed. In that gaze, Sarah saw not just her own future, but the future of everyone who would inherit the world that emerged from this moment. "I'm a mother now," she said simply, "and I refuse to hand my daughter a world where justice is a commodity." Helen's finger touched the final key as the sound of boots echoed in the upper corridors. Around them, every screen in the chamber lit up simultaneously as terabytes of carefully organized evidence began flooding toward news outlets, law enforcement agencies, and international courts with the unstoppable force of an avalanche. Sarah felt her daughter's tiny hand tighten around her finger as the future exploded into motion around them. Somewhere above, armed men were fighting their way toward a prize that no longer existed, not because it had been hidden, but because it had been given away to everyone at once. The final test wasn't about surviving her inheritance. It was about having the courage to transform it from burden into gift, from secret into revolution. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper through the mountain stone. "Some truths are too important to carry alone, Lee Sparrow. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let them fly." The chamber erupted into chaos as the first explosion echoed through the facility's upper levels. Sarah clutched her daughter protectively as concrete dust rained from the ceiling, her newborn's first cry cutting through the sound of splintering metal and approaching combat boots. "They're through the main entrance," Agent Walsh reported, her team taking defensive positions around the computer terminals. 2 minutes until they reach us." But Sarah's attention was fixed on the monitors surrounding them, watching as her grandmother's 40 years of evidence flooded across the globe in real time. News outlets, government agencies, international courts, all receiving simultaneous confirmation that every major institution they'd trusted had been systematically compromised. "The stock markets are crashing," Helen announced, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and terror. "London, Tokyo, New York, everything's in free fall as the algorithm targets drop." Martinez laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Congratulations, Sarah. You've just triggered the largest economic collapse in human history. I hope your daughter enjoys inheriting the wasteland." Sarah felt her child's tiny fingers curl around her thumb with surprising strength, anchoring her to this moment when everything was reshaping itself around them. Through the chaos of alarms and approaching violence, she found a clarity that surprised her. Not the desperate focus of survival, but the calm certainty of someone who had finally stopped running from their purpose. "Agent Walsh," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "The evidence release. It's automated now, correct? Nothing they can do will stop it." Distributed across 17 countries, multiple backup systems. "Even if they destroy this entire facility, the flood will continue for hours." Walsh paused her radio coordination to look directly at Sarah. "Your grandmother built this to be unstoppable once triggered." The sound of gunfire erupted in the corridors above, Walsh's backup teams engaging the intruders. Sarah recognized the tactical rhythm, controlled bursts, coordinated movement, professionals fighting professionals. But the attackers had overwhelming numbers and superior equipment. "There's another way out," Helen said suddenly, her fingers dancing across a different interface. "My Lynn showed me once, an emergency tunnel that connects to the old mining shafts. It's not on any of the official plans." A hidden panel in the chamber's far wall slid open, revealing a narrow passage carved directly into the mountain stone. Sarah could feel cold air flowing through it, carrying the scent of snow and pine, the outside world freedom but also unknown dangers for a woman who'd given birth less than an hour ago. "Go," Agent Walsh commanded. "We'll hold them here as long as possible." But Sarah found herself hesitating, not from fear but from a sudden understanding of what this moment truly represented. Her grandmother had spent 4 decades preparing for this confrontation, building toward this exact collision between old corruption and new accountability. Running now would save their lives, but it would also abandon the symbolic weight of what they'd accomplished. "Sarah, we need to move," Helen urged, gathering essential equipment from the computer stations. Another explosion, closer this time, sent a spiderweb of cracks across the reinforced windows. Through the damaged glass, Sarah could see the lights of the mercenary helicopters, their searchlights cutting through the Montana darkness like mechanical predators. Her daughter stirred against her chest, making small sounds that weren't quite cries, more like questions, as if she too sensed the magnitude of what was happening around them. Sarah found herself answering in whispered Mandarin, the lullabies her grandmother had taught her decades ago, now carrying new weight as promises to the future. "The world my grandmother lived in required shadows," Sarah said, surprising everyone, including herself, with the firmness in her voice. "Secrets and careful maneuvering and evidence hidden for decades because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud." She looked down at her daughter's perfect, fearless face. "But that world is ending right now. Every second we delay, more evidence reaches more people, makes it harder for anyone to bury this again." The gunfire was getting closer, individual voices now audible through the tactical radio chatter. Orders barked in accents Sarah couldn't identify, references to retrieval and containment and acceptable losses. "They're not trying to stop the evidence release," she realized aloud. "It's too late for that. They're trying to eliminate the witnesses." Martinez's expression shifted, professional calculation replacing his earlier smugness. "The people I work for understand that evidence without credible sources is just data. But if the key witnesses have tragic accidents, if the story becomes about unstable individuals making unfounded accusations, then the evidence gets discredited regardless of its accuracy," Walsh finished grimly. Sarah felt something hardening inside her chest, a resolve that went beyond maternal instinct or survival impulse. Her grandmother had spent a lifetime documenting the truth, But documentation was only the first step. Someone had to be willing to stand behind that truth when the real powers fought back. The chamber doors exploded inward, just as Helen reached the emergency tunnel. Armed figures in black tactical gear poured through the breach, weapons raised, faces hidden behind masks that transformed them into instruments rather than people. Sarah held her daughter closer and made her choice. "Helen, go!" Sarah shouted, pushing the other woman toward the emergency tunnel, even as tactical lasers swept across the chamber. "Take the backup drives!" But instead of following Helen into the escape route, Sarah turned back toward the central computer terminal. Her daughter's cry pierced the chaos as bullets shattered screens around them, but Sarah's hands moved with desperate precision across the interface. "What are you doing?" Walsh yelled, laying down covering fire. Sarah's fingers found the sequence Mei Lin had shown her in the journals, the final safeguard. The option her grandmother had prayed would never be necessary. "They want to discredit the evidence by eliminating the witnesses," she called back, her voice steady despite the violence erupting around them. "But what if the witness doesn't disappear?" The lead mercenary was advancing through the gunfire, his weapon trained directly on Sarah and her newborn daughter. Through his tactical mask, she could see cold, professional eyes, the kind that had ended other inconvenient lives without hesitation. Sarah's thumb hovered over the final command as her daughter's tiny fist pressed against her chest, right over her heart. In that touch, she felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment, her grandmother's decades of patient documentation, her own decision to trigger the mass evidence release, and now this, the ultimate sacrifice that would transform her from victim to legend. The command would activate every camera in the facility, broadcasting live to news outlets worldwide, not just the evidence dump of documents and recordings, but real-time footage of armed mercenaries attempting to murder a new mother and her infant daughter to protect institutional corruption, the kind of image that no amount of money or influence could erase from public consciousness. "You don't understand," she whispered to her daughter in Mandarin, the same words her grandmother had used in the journals when describing her hardest choices. "Sometimes the only way to protect the future is to become part of history." Martinez was shouting orders from behind his restraints, demanding the mercenaries stand down, but Sarah realized he'd lost control the moment the evidence started flowing. The powers behind him had moved beyond his careful political manipulations to pure violence, and that desperation was exactly what she needed. Her thumb pressed down as the lead mercenary raised his weapon. Every monitor in the chamber blazed to life simultaneously, broadcasting to 17 news networks across 6 continents. The footage was crystal clear, a new mother holding her hours-old daughter while armed figures advanced with lethal intent, all because she'd chosen to expose the truth about systematic corruption. The mercenary hesitated, suddenly aware that his next action would be witnessed by millions of viewers in real time. Sarah saw the exact moment he understood that killing her now would transform her from an inconvenient witness into a martyr whose death would validate every piece of evidence her grandmother had gathered. "You can't shoot me," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the chamber with absolute certainty. "Not anymore. The entire world is watching." But even as she spoke, she felt the terrible weight of what she'd just sacrificed, the quiet life she'd dreamed of, the chance to raise her daughter away from the spotlight of international attention, the possibility of simple, anonymous happiness. All of it was streaming away through the cameras she'd just activated. Her daughter would grow up as the child who was born into the center of the largest corruption scandal in history. She would never have privacy, never have the luxury of being ordinary, never escape the shadow of this moment. The mercenaries' radio crackled with urgent orders: abort, extract, deny everything. Sarah watched his tactical team begin their withdrawal, but she knew this was only the beginning. The cameras were still rolling, the evidence was still flowing, and the world was now fully awake to the scope of the conspiracy her grandmother had spent 40 years exposing. Agent Walsh reached her side as the immediate danger receded. "Sarah, you need medical attention. And that baby will be fine," Sarah finished, though her voice carried new exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. She looked down at her daughter's face, memorizing this last moment before their lives became public property. She'll have to be. Through the shattered windows, she could see news helicopters joining the tactical aircraft in the Montana sky. The story was already being written, broadcast, analyzed by experts who would never understand the quiet sacrifice behind the dramatic footage. Her daughter opened her eyes, dark, curious, fearless, and Sarah realized that perhaps anonymity had never been an option anyway. This child was Mei Lin Chen's great-granddaughter, born at the exact moment when 40 years of hidden truth exploded into the light. She was always going to be part of history. Sarah's sacrifice wasn't her daughter's privacy. It was her own last illusion that they could somehow escape the weight of their inheritance. The cameras were still rolling, the world was still watching, and the future was beginning whether they were ready or not. Victory required sacrifice. She had just paid the price. The cameras continued rolling as medical personnel rushed into the chamber, their equipment clattering against debris from the firefight. Sarah watched the EMTs approach with professional urgency, but her arms tightened protectively around her daughter. After everything that had happened in the last hour, trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. "I need to examine both of you," the lead paramedic said, his voice gentle but insistent. "Birth complications, possible shock, the baby needs immediate assessment." Agent Walsh stepped between them and Sarah, her hand resting on her weapon. Credentials, full verification. The request wasn't paranoia. It was acknowledgement that the forces they'd just exposed wouldn't simply accept defeat. As the EMTs provided documentation, Sarah felt the strange dislocation of being simultaneously the most protected and most vulnerable person in America. Every news outlet in the world was broadcasting her location, but that same attention was the only thing keeping her alive. Her daughter made a small sound, somewhere between contentment and curiosity, as if the chaos around them was simply an interesting new environment to explore. Sarah found herself smiling despite everything, recognizing something of Mei Lin's fearless determination in that tiny, perfect face. "The markets are stabilizing," Helen reported from the emergency tunnel entrance, her laptop balanced precariously on a pile of rubble. "Not recovering, stabilizing." The evidence release forced them to halt trading before the collapse became irreversible. Martinez, still zip-tied but now ignored by everyone, let out a bitter laugh. "You think this is victory? You've just given every authoritarian regime on the planet an excuse to crack down on financial transparency. The backlash will be democracy," Sarah interrupted, allowing the EMT to check her daughter's vitals while keeping her cradled against her chest. Messy, chaotic, imperfect democracy instead of elegant, efficient corruption. Through the shattered windows, she could see the first civilian aircraft joining the news helicopters, probably federal investigators, international observers, maybe even family members who'd seen the broadcasts and were racing to Montana. The isolation that had defined this place for 40 years was ending in real time. Agent Walsh's radio crackled with updates from the outside world. European authorities were raiding banks in Switzerland and Luxembourg. The FBI was executing simultaneous warrants across 17 states. Interpol had issued red notices for individuals whose names had appeared in Mei Lin's carefully documented network. "Your grandmother would be proud," Walsh said quietly, settling beside Sarah as the EMTs continued their examination. "And terrified. She spent decades trying to prevent exactly this kind of explosive exposure." Sarah considered that, watching her daughter's eyes track the movement of the medical equipment with obvious fascination. She was protecting a world that no longer exists. The careful, patient approach worked when information moved slowly, when powerful people could control narratives for months or years. She gestured toward the still broadcasting cameras. "But my daughter is being born into a world where truth travels at light speed. The old strategies aren't just obsolete, they're counterproductive." The lead EMT looked up from his assessment with visible relief. "Both of you are remarkably stable, considering." The baby's vitals are perfect. Mother shows signs of exhaustion but no immediate complications. We should transport you to a hospital for full evaluation, but there's no emergency. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. Her daughter was healthy. Whatever else happened, whatever consequences emerged from the choices made in this underground chamber, her child would face them from a position of strength. "Where would you take us?" she asked. "Kalispell Regional," the EMT replied. 40 minutes by helicopter, full trauma and obstetric capabilities. But Sarah found herself hesitating. The moment she left this mountain, she would become public property in a way that felt both necessary and terrifying. Her daughter's first photographs would be taken by news crews. Her own words would be analyzed by intelligence agencies and academic experts. Every decision would be scrutinized by people who'd never held a newborn while armed mercenaries advanced through gunfire. Helen approached with her laptop, screen displaying a cascade of news alerts and social media responses. The story's already evolving beyond the evidence dumps. #BornIntoTruth is trending worldwide. Your daughter is becoming a symbol. Sarah looked down at the small face pressed against her chest, memorizing the peaceful expression that might be impossible to maintain once they left this place. Her daughter would never know anonymity, would always carry the weight of being born at the exact moment when 40 years of hidden corruption exploded into public view. But perhaps that was fitting. This child was Mai Lin Chen's great-granddaughter, inheriting not just a fortune built on exposed secrets, but the responsibility to guard against future ones. The burden was enormous, but so was the opportunity. "Agent Walsh," Sarah said finally, "I want guarantees, full protection, complete transparency about security arrangements, and absolute honesty about what my daughter's life is going to look like." Walsh nodded grimly. "You'll have everything we can provide. But Sarah, you just changed the world. That comes with consequences we can't predict or control." Sarah felt her daughter's tiny hand curl around her finger with surprising strength. The grip felt like a promise, or maybe a question about the future they would face together. The cameras were still rolling, the world was still watching, and somewhere in that global attention, justice was finally beginning. The return. 3 months later, Sarah stood at the window of her new apartment in downtown Denver, watching her daughter sleep in the reinforced nursery that had become as familiar as it was surreal. The bulletproof glass offered a clear view of the Rocky Mountains, but also of the discreet security vehicles that had become permanent fixtures on the street below. This was what returning to the world looked like when you'd blown it apart on live television. "Lily Chen Morrison," she whispered, testing her daughter's full name in the quiet morning light. They'd chosen Lily for its meaning, purity emerging from muddy water, though Sarah suspected the symbolism would follow her daughter for the rest of her life. Everything about this child would be interpreted, analyzed, turned into metaphor by people who'd never held her during a 3 a.m. feeding. The apartment was nothing like the life Sarah had imagined during those quiet moments in her grandmother's cabin. Instead of rustic simplicity, she lived surrounded by technology that would have impressed Mai Lin: surveillance systems, encrypted communications, background checks for grocery delivery. But strangest of all was how normal it had started to feel. Her phone buzzed with the morning briefing, Agent Walsh's daily update on ongoing investigations, trial proceedings, and threat assessments. 47 arrests across 12 countries, over $2 billion in assets frozen, congressional hearings scheduled through next spring. The mountain of evidence her grandmother had compiled was still reshaping the global financial landscape, one revelation at a time. "Good morning, world changer," Helen called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who'd become family through crisis. She'd moved in after the 3rd week, when Sarah realized she needed help navigating a life where even buying baby formula required security protocols. "Lily's trending again. Something about her first smile being caught by that photographer in the park yesterday." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. The photographer had been discreet, professional, shooting from a distance that respected their space while still feeding the public's insatiable appetite for updates on the truth baby. She'd learned to distinguish between invasive paparazzi and legitimate journalists, though the line felt increasingly meaningless when every moment of her daughter's life became public property. "The foundation paperwork is ready for your signature," Helen continued, settling beside Sarah with coffee and a tablet displaying legal documents. "The Mei Lin Chen Foundation for Financial Transparency, initial funding from the recovered assets, oversight board including 3 ethics professors and 2 former prosecutors." Sarah accepted the tablet, scrolling through the mission statement she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. Her grandmother's money, blood money, stolen money, carefully documented money, would fund the very transparency systems that could have prevented her crimes in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the editorial writers who'd made it their favorite metaphor for systemic redemption. But as she looked down at Lily's sleeping face, Sarah realized the foundation wasn't really about irony or redemption. It was about choice. Her grandmother had operated in a world where transparency was dangerous, where truth required shadows and patience and elaborate deceptions. Sarah's daughter would grow up in a world where those shadows were harder to maintain, where truth moved too fast for careful manipulation. "Are you sure about the Senate testimony?" Helen asked gently. "It's not too late to send a written statement instead." The hearing was scheduled for next week, Sarah's first public appearance since the mountain. She would sit before cameras again, but this time in a wood-paneled committee room instead of an underground bunker, answering questions about her grandmother's network instead of dodging bullets from mercenaries. "I'm sure," Sarah said, though her voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned that certainty was more fragile than it appeared. "She spent 40 years gathering evidence that no one could hear. The least I can do is make sure people listen." Lily stirred in her crib, making the small sounds that meant she was transitioning toward wakefulness. Sarah moved to lift her, marveling as she did every morning at how solid her daughter felt, how real and present and unimpressed by the historical significance of her own existence. "Good morning, little one," Sarah murmured in Mandarin, continuing the linguistic tradition that connected 3 generations of women who'd made impossible choices. "Your great-grandmother would have liked to meet you. She would have understood what you represent." As Lily's eyes opened, dark, alert, fearless, Sarah saw something she recognized. Not just Mei Lin's determination, but something entirely new, the gaze of someone born into truth instead of secrecy, raised in transparency instead of shadows. This child would never have to choose between safety and honesty because she'd never known a world where the two were incompatible. The morning light caught Lily's face as she smiled, and Sarah realized this was what victory actually looked like. Not the dramatic confrontation in the mountain chamber, not the global headlines or congressional investigations, but this, a child who could grow up assuming the world was watchable, questionable, ultimately accountable. Sarah had returned to the world, but she'd brought something back with her, a future that her grandmother could only have imagined, carried in the arms of a daughter who would never need to hide. The new beginning. 1 year later, Sarah watched through the kitchen window as Lily took her first unsteady steps across the backyard of their new house in Missoula, her tiny hands reaching toward the mountain peaks visible in the distance. The security detail had been reduced to 2 agents who'd learned to blend into the neighborhood rhythm, and the media attention had settled into something manageable, periodic updates rather than constant scrutiny. "Mama," Lily babbled, her first clear word emerging as she wobbled toward the garden where Sarah had planted vegetables from seeds Helen had brought from her grandmother's farm. The normalcy of it, dirt under her fingernails, baby laughter, the simple act of growing food, felt revolutionary after everything they'd survived. Agent Walsh appeared at the back gate, no longer wearing tactical gear but still carrying herself with the alertness that had become familiar. She visited monthly now, ostensibly for security updates, but really to check on the small family that had become personal for her in ways the FBI manual never addressed. "The last of Martinez's network was sentenced yesterday," Walsh reported, settling into one of the patio chairs Sarah had arranged with deliberate optimism. 18 years federal prison, the Swiss accounts have been fully recovered, and the foundation transfer is complete. Sarah nodded, feeling the satisfaction of loose ends finally tied. The Mei Lin Chen Foundation had disbursed its first grants last month, funding transparency initiatives in 12 countries, supporting investigative journalism, building the digital infrastructure that could prevent future conspiracies from taking root in shadow. Her grandmother's blood money was becoming something clean, one carefully audited dollar at a time. "How are you doing?" Walsh asked, watching Lily discover the fascinating properties of dandelions. "Really doing," not the official statement version. Sarah considered the question, surprised to realize she had an honest answer. "I'm okay. Different than I expected to be, but okay." She gestured toward the mountains, where her grandmother's cabin remained untouched, preserved by the National Park Service as a historical site. "I thought I'd feel more haunted by all of it. Instead, I feel free." It was true in ways that still surprised her. The secrets that had defined her family for 2 generations were gone, replaced by transparency so complete it had become protective. Every dollar of their inheritance was documented, every security arrangement was public record, every foundation decision was broadcast live. Her daughter would grow up without the weight of hidden knowledge, raised in a world where truth was the default rather than the exception. Lily stumbled, caught herself with the fearless determination Sarah recognized from her own childhood, and continued her exploration of grass and flowers and the fascinating complexity of shadows. She would have no memory of underground chambers or midnight flights or the terror of giving birth while armed figures approached through gunfire. Her earliest experiences were sunshine and safety and the assumption that the world was knowable. "The Congressional Committee wants to name you to the new Financial Crimes Prevention Panel," Walsh mentioned casually. "Advisory role, work-from-home flexibility, chance to shape policy instead of just surviving it." Sarah felt a familiar flutter of resistance, the desire to retreat, to protect her small family from further exposure, to finally claim the quiet life she'd dreamed of in those last weeks of pregnancy. But as she watched Lily discover the joy of making noise by slapping her hands against leaves, she realized that quiet had never really been an option. "I'll consider it," she said, meaning yes, but needing time to accept what yes would mean. Her phone buzzed with a text from Helen, who was finishing her documentary about the case, a project that had evolved from news coverage into something approaching art. The message included a photo from the film's rough cut, Sarah holding newborn Lily in the underground chamber, both of them caught in the moment just after the cameras had gone live. Sarah barely recognized herself in the image, seeing instead someone who looked older, fiercer, fundamentally transformed by the act of choosing truth over safety. "Your grandmother kept journals," Walsh said suddenly. "Personal ones, separate from the evidence files. We found them last week and I think you should read them." She handed Sarah a slim leather book, its pages filled with Mei Lin's careful handwriting in both English and Chinese. Sarah opened it randomly, finding an entry dated 3 months before her grandmother's death. "If Sarah ever reads this, I hope she understands that every choice I made was an attempt to build a world where she would never need to make the same ones. But perhaps each generation must find its own way to fight for truth. Perhaps the specific battles matter less than the willingness to engage them." Lily had worked her way back across the yard, her small hands now reaching for Sarah's legs with the absolute confidence of someone who had never doubted that safety and love were permanent features of existence. Sarah lifted her daughter, feeling the solid weight of a future that belonged entirely to this fearless, curious, utterly transparent little person. "Yes," Sarah said to Walsh, though she was looking at Lily. "Yes to the committee, yes to whatever comes next. We're ready." As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, 3 generations of choices, her grandmother's hidden courage, her own explosive honesty, and her daughter's inherited fearlessness, settled into something that felt like peace. The mountains remained constant, but everything else had changed, and the change was good.